were purchased, and an entire continental empire was stitched together from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So the question isn't just academic, it's actually kind of urgent. How did the most powerful nation on earth finance itself for over a century without ever taking a cut of your paycheck? And perhaps more importantly, what changed in 1913 that fundamentally rewired the relationship between the American citizen and the federal government forever? The answers to those questions take us deep into a story about whiskey rebellions and tariff wars, about land grabs and backroom deals, about the raw tension between a government that desperately needed money and a population that was deeply, almost pathologically, allergic to being taxed. Because here's the thing most people don't realize. The Founding Fathers didn't just avoid income taxes by accident. They built an entire constitutional architecture designed to make a direct tax on income almost impossible. And the story of how that architecture was eventually dismantled, piece by piece, over more than a century of conflict, economic upheaval, and political maneuvering, well, that story is one of the most revealing chapters in American history. A chapter that explains, in many ways, why the government we have today looks nothing like the one the founders originally designed. So let me take you back to the beginning, to a moment when America was flat broke, drowning in debt, and scrambling to figure out how to keep the lights on without tearing itself apart. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the newly independent United States was not exactly in a position to celebrate. The war had been won, yes, but the financial cost had been staggering. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, had accumulated roughly $54 million in debt. The individual states had piled on another $25 million. And here was the problem. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no independent power to levy taxes. None. It could request money from the states, which sounds polite until you realize that the states routinely ignored those requests. The central government was essentially a beggar in its own house, and by the mid-1780s, the country's finances were in complete disarray. This financial crisis was one of the driving forces behind the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The men who gathered in Philadelphia understood that a government without the power to fund itself was no government at all. And so, when they drafted the new Constitution, they explicitly granted Congress the authority to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. But here's the critical detail that most people overlook. The founders were deeply suspicious of direct taxation, meaning any tax levied directly on individuals or their property. They had just fought a revolution against a king who taxed them without representation. The last thing they wanted was to create a new government with the unchecked power to reach into people's pockets whenever it pleased. So they built in a safeguard. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution stated that no capitation or other direct tax could be laid unless it was apportioned among the states according to their population. Now, this might sound like a minor technicality, but it was actually a near impossible hurdle. Apportionment meant that if the federal government wanted to raise, say, $10 million through a direct tax, it couldn't simply charge every citizen the same rate. Instead, it would have to divide that $10 million among the states based on how many people lived in each one. A state with 10% of the population would owe $1 million, regardless of whether its citizens were rich or poor. This made direct taxation absurdly impractical and unfair. A poor farmer in Georgia would end up paying a higher effective rate than a wealthy merchant in New York, simply because their states had different population to wealth ratios. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. They were making direct taxation so cumbersome that the government would almost never resort to it. And for the most part, that's exactly how things played out. For the next 124 years, the federal government funded itself through a completely different set of mechanisms that seem almost alien to us today. The first and most important of these mechanisms was the tariff. When George Washington took office in 1789, the very first major piece of legislation signed into law was the Tariff Act of 1789, also known as the Hamilton Tariff, named after Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who championed it. The concept was beautifully simple. Every time a foreign good, whether it was British textiles, French wine, Caribbean sugar, or Chinese tea, entered an American port, The importer would pay a duty on it to the federal government. These duties were collected at a relatively small number of harbors along the eastern seaboard, which made enforcement straightforward. You didn't need a massive bureaucracy to make it work. You just needed customs collectors stationed at the docks. And for a young agricultural nation that imported a huge proportion of its manufactured goods from Europe, tariffs were extraordinarily effective at generating revenue. From 1790 to 1860, tariffs accounted for roughly 90% of all federal revenue, according to economic historian Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College. In some years, that figure climbed as high as 95%. The tariff was the engine that kept the entire federal machine running. It paid for the Army, it paid for the Navy, it serviced the national debt, and it did all of this without the government ever having to knock on a single citizen's door and demand a percentage of their earnings. But Hamilton didn't just see tariffs as a revenue tool. He was thinking several moves ahead, like the financial chess player he was. In his 1791 Report on Manufactures, Hamilton argued that tariffs could serve a dual purpose. Yes, they would fill the treasury, but they could also protect America's fledgling industrial sector from being crushed by the far more advanced manufacturing economies of Britain and Europe. By making imported goods more expensive, tariffs would encourage Americans to buy domestically produced alternatives, which would in turn nurture homegrown industry. It was protectionism dressed up as fiscal policy, and it worked spectacularly well. By 1800, federal revenues had nearly tripled from a mere $3.7 million in 1792 to $10.8 million, and roughly 90% of that came from tariffs. The United States suddenly had the best credit rating in Europe, its government bonds selling above par. For a nation that had been effectively bankrupt just a decade earlier, it was an astonishing turnaround. Now, Hamilton understood that relying exclusively on tariffs was risky. Trade was volatile. Wars, recessions, and diplomatic disputes could all disrupt the flow of imports, and with them, the flow of revenue. So he also pushed for an additional source of income, something that would supplement the tariffs and provide a buffer during lean times. And that's where the trouble began, because the supplementary revenue source Hamilton had in mind was an excise tax, specifically a tax on domestically distilled spirits, whiskey. In January of 1791, Hamilton proposed what seemed, on the surface, like a perfectly reasonable measure. A small tax on whiskey produced within the United States, the proceeds of which would be used to pay down the national debt, including the state debts that the federal government had recently assumed. Congress passed the measure, and President Washington signed it into law. But Hamilton had badly miscalculated the reaction. On the western frontier of Pennsylvania, whiskey was not a luxury. It was an economic lifeline. Farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains grew corn, rye, and grain in abundance. But shipping raw crops eastward over terrible mountain roads was prohibitively expensive. So they distilled their grain into whiskey, which was lighter, more durable, and far easier to transport. In many frontier communities, whiskey literally served as currency. People paid their debts in whiskey. They traded whiskey for tools and supplies. And now the federal government, sitting comfortably in Philadelphia, hundreds of miles away, was demanding a tax on every gallon produced. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Tax collectors who ventured into western Pennsylvania were met with threats, beatings, and worse. One particularly unfortunate revenue officer named Robert Johnson was stripped naked, tarred and feathered, and left tied to a tree in the middle of the forest. Others had their homes burned. Those who cooperated with federal officials faced anonymous threats signed by a mysterious figure known as Tom the Tinker. The message was clear: pay the whiskey tax and your barn might burn down. By the summer of 1794, the situation had escalated into a full-blown armed insurrection. Nearly 400 armed men surrounded the home of John Neville, the regional tax inspector, and shots were exchanged. One militiaman was killed. Within weeks, 7,000 frontier rebels had gathered near Pittsburgh, threatening to seize the federal armory and, some whispered, to declare independence from the United States entirely. Rumors reached Philadelphia that rebel leaders were negotiating with the British and the Spanish for recognition as a sovereign entity. President Washington saw this as an existential threat to the young republic. If a minority could dictate to the majority by force, he declared, then Republican government was finished. He nationalized nearly 13,000 militia from 4 surrounding states and personally rode west at the head of the column, making him the only sitting president in American history to take the field as commander-in-chief. When the army arrived near Pittsburgh, the rebellion collapsed without a major battle. Around 150 men were arrested, 2 were convicted of treason, and both were pardoned by Washington. The Whiskey Rebellion was over. But its political aftershocks would reverberate for years. Thomas Jefferson, who had warned Washington that excise taxes would provoke exactly this kind of backlash, rode the wave of anti-tax sentiment all the way to the presidency. And one of his first acts upon taking office in 1801 was to repeal every single internal tax, including the whiskey excise. Under Jefferson, the federal government would rely solely on tariff revenue, a position it would maintain until the financial pressures of the War of 1812 forced Congress to briefly reimpose excise taxes. Those too were repealed after the war ended. And so a pattern emerged that would define American fiscal policy for the next half-century. In peacetime, tariffs paid for everything. In wartime, the government would reluctantly impose temporary excise taxes and take on debt, only to repeal those taxes the moment the crisis passed. The underlying philosophy was clear. Americans would tolerate being taxed at the border, where the levy was hidden inside the price of imported goods, but they would not tolerate being taxed at home, where the hand of the government reached directly into their daily lives. This arrangement worked remarkably well, in large part because the federal government of the early 1800s was almost unrecognizably small by modern standards. It had no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no welfare programs, no agricultural subsidies, no Department of Education, no Department of Energy, no Environmental Protection Agency. The entire federal civilian workforce in 1800 numbered just a few thousand people. Military spending that year was roughly $2.5 million, less than 0.5% of GDP. The federal budget for 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, was approximately $78 million, and the accumulated national debt stood at $65 million. These are numbers that a modern government would burn through in a matter of hours. But tariffs alone weren't the whole story. The federal government had another ace up its sleeve, one that was unique to the American situation and that no European power could replicate. It had land, an unimaginable amount of it. When the original 13 colonies won their independence, vast stretches of territory west of the Appalachians suddenly fell under federal control. And as the nation expanded through purchases, treaties, and conquests, Louisiana, Florida, the Oregon Territory, the Mexican Cession, the federal government found itself sitting on hundreds of millions of acres of public land. This land was a financial asset of almost incomprehensible value, and selling it became a major source of federal revenue. The Land Ordinance of 1785 established a systematic method for surveying and selling public land. Initially, the government required buyers to purchase a minimum of 640 acres at $1 per acre, but over time the terms became more accessible. The Harrison Land Act of 1800 halved the minimum purchase to 320 acres and allowed buyers to pay in installments. The Land Act of 1820 reduced the minimum further to 80 acres and dropped the price to $1.25 per acre. The revenue from land sales was not trivial. On average, it equaled about 14% of the revenue generated from customs duties. And in certain boom years, especially during the land rushes of the 1830s, when the removal of Native American tribes opened vast new territories in the South and West, land sales spiked dramatically. In 1836 alone, over 20 million acres of public land were sold, generating a torrent of revenue that actually pushed the federal government into surplus. In fact, under President Andrew Jackson in 1835, the United States achieved something that has never been accomplished before or since. The national debt was paid off entirely, reduced to a grand total of $38,000. The proceeds from land sales, pledged by Congress specifically for debt retirement, had achieved what seemed impossible. But the land revenue system was also deeply entangled with some of the darker chapters of American history. Much of the land being sold had been acquired through the forced removal of Native American tribes, whose claims to the territory predated the arrival of Europeans by thousands of years. The revenue pouring into federal coffers was, in a very real sense, built on dispossession. And the debates over how to use the public domain, whether to sell it for revenue, give it away to settlers through homesteading laws, or grant it to railroad companies to spur development, became some of the most contentious political fights of the 19th century, fights that intersected directly with the question of slavery and ultimately helped push the nation toward civil war. By the time the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the comfortable fiscal world of tariffs and land sales was about to be blown apart. The Civil War would cost the Union approximately $5.2 billion, an astronomical figure that dwarfed anything the federal government had ever spent. Before the war, the government had been spending roughly $172,000 per day. By the time of the Battle of Bull Run, just 3 months later, the War Department alone was burning through $1 million a day. By the war's end, the Treasury was spending $80 million a month. Tariff revenues, which depended on international trade, plummeted as the war disrupted shipping and the Confederate blockade strangled southern ports. The government needed money, and it needed it fast. So for the first time in American history, Congress did the unthinkable. It imposed a tax directly on the income of its citizens. The Revenue Act of 1861, signed by President Abraham Lincoln on August 5th of that year, levied a flat 3% tax on all annual incomes above $800. At the time, only about 3% of the population earned that much, so the tax was narrowly targeted. But the 1861 Act was hastily written and lacked any real enforcement mechanism, which meant it generated almost no revenue. The following year, Congress passed the much more comprehensive Revenue Act of 1862, which President Lincoln signed on July 1st. This was the real game changer. The 1862 Act introduced America's first progressive income tax, 3% on incomes between $610,000 and 5% on everything above that. Later, the Revenue Act of 1864 ratcheted the top rate up to 10%. But the income tax was just one piece of a much larger fiscal revolution. The 1862 Act also imposed excise taxes on virtually everything that moved: liquor, tobacco, playing cards, gunpowder, feathers, telegrams, iron, leather, pianos, yachts, carriages, billiard tables, jewelry, patent medicines, newspaper advertisements, manufactured goods, processed meats, professional licenses, corporate profits, even inheritance taxes. David Wells, who chaired the Revenue Commission in 1865, later described the philosophy behind the law with a darkly comic metaphor. He said Congress was guided by a principle similar to the advice given to a certain Irishman visiting a fair, which was, "Whenever you see a head, hit it." Congress, Wells observed, followed a similar instinct. Whenever you find an article, a product, a trade, a profession, or a source of income, tax it. Crucially, the 1862 Act also created the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, a brand new agency within the Treasury Department whose sole purpose was to collect these taxes. The commissioner started with a staff of just 3 clerks. Within months, he had nearly 4,000 employees, including assessors and collectors spread across the country, many of them earning commissions on the taxes they brought in. This was the birth of the agency that would eventually become the Internal Revenue Service. The income tax raised relatively modest sums at first, just $2.7 million in its first full fiscal year. But revenue climbed rapidly, reaching over $20 million the following year and continuing to grow as the war dragged on. Still, taxes of all kinds, including the income tax, the excise taxes, and higher tariffs, financed only about 1/5 of the Union's total war costs. The rest came from borrowing, including the sale of $500 million in government war bonds and from a revolutionary new financial instrument, the greenback. These were paper treasury notes that circulated as currency, essentially allowing the government to print money to pay its soldiers and suppliers. But here's the detail that matters most for our story. The Civil War income tax was always understood to be temporary. It was a wartime emergency measure, justified by the extraordinary circumstances of national survival. And true to that understanding, Congress repealed the income tax in 1872, 7 years after the war ended, at a time when the federal budget was running a healthy surplus thanks to high tariffs and robust excise tax collections on liquor and tobacco. For the next 2 decades, the federal government returned to its pre-war fiscal playbook. Tariffs remained the dominant source of revenue, though they now shared the stage with excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco. In fact, during the decades following the Civil War, roughly 90% of all federal revenue came from these two sources, customs duties and sin taxes. The income tax was gone, and most Americans assumed it was gone for good. But the political landscape was shifting beneath the surface. The late 19th century was the age of the robber barons, of Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan, of staggering industrial growth coupled with equally staggering inequality. The tariff, which had once seemed like an elegant and painless way to fund the government, was increasingly under attack from 2 directions. Farmers and workers in the South and West argued that tariffs were deeply regressive. They fell hardest on ordinary people who spent a much higher proportion of their income on imported goods than the wealthy did. A poor farmer buying a British-made plow paid the same tariff markup as a New York banker, but for the farmer, that markup represented a far larger share of his earnings. At the same time, the tariff had become a tool of cronyism. Northern manufacturing interests lobbied relentlessly for higher tariffs to protect their industries from foreign competition, effectively using the government's revenue system to enrich themselves at the expense of consumers. Tariff rates climbed to their highest levels in history with the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which pushed the average duty on imported goods from about 38% to nearly 50%. Working-class Americans were paying more for basic necessities so that industrialists could pad their margins. The system that was supposed to fund the government had become a wealth transfer mechanism, moving money from the pockets of the many into the vaults of the few. And so, in the crucible of Gilded Age inequality, a new idea began to take hold. What if, instead of taxing goods that everyone consumed, the government taxed income, specifically the income of the wealthy? This wasn't a radical concept. The Civil War had proven that an income tax was administratively feasible and could generate significant revenue. But turning it into a permanent policy required overcoming the constitutional hurdle that the founders had erected, the requirement that direct taxes be apportioned among the states by population. In 1894, amid a severe economic depression that had forced 600 banks to close their doors, Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which included a provision for a 2% tax on incomes exceeding $4,000, roughly the equivalent of $90,000 today. It was America's first peacetime income tax, and it was designed to shift the tax burden toward the wealthy. The political dynamics were fascinating. Many members of Congress voted for the bill, fully expecting that the Supreme Court would strike it down as unconstitutional, which would allow them to tell their constituents they tried without actually having to live with the consequences. And that is precisely what happened. In 1895, in the landmark case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the income tax was unconstitutional. The majority held that a tax on income derived from property, including rent, interest, and dividends, was essentially a direct tax that had to be apportioned among the states according to population. Since the Wilson-Gorman Act made no provision for apportionment, the entire income tax provision was struck down. The decision was incendiary. Justice Henry Brown, one of the 4 dissenters, wrote that the ruling involved nothing less than the surrender of the taxing power to the moneyed class. Farmers, workers, and populist politicians were outraged. They saw the decision as exactly what it appeared to be, a shield erected by the wealthy to protect themselves from contributing their fair share to the cost of government. The Democratic Party immediately made the income tax a central plank of its platform, charging the court with judicial usurpation. But constitutional amendments are not easy to pass. They require a two-thirds vote in both houses of Congress and ratification by three-fourths of the states. For the next decade and a half, the income tax question simmered, fueled by the rising progressive movement, which argued that the entire political and economic system had been captured by corporate interests and needed to be fundamentally reformed. The breakthrough came from an unlikely champion, President William Howard Taft, a conservative Republican who was hardly a populist firebrand. In 1909, Taft proposed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which would give Congress the explicit power to levy taxes on income from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the states and without regard to any census or enumeration. It was a surgical strike against the Pollock decision, removing the constitutional obstacle that had blocked a permanent income tax for over a century. The ratification process took nearly 4 years, during which opponents mounted a fierce resistance. Wealthy industrialists and their allies argued that an income tax would make the federal government dangerously powerful and centralized, that it would punish success and discourage enterprise. Conservative senators with deep ties to major corporations fought the amendment at every turn. But the political winds were against them. The progressive movement was at its peak. The Democratic Party had won the 1912 presidential election with Woodrow Wilson, and the public mood was overwhelmingly in favor of taxing the rich. On February 3, 1913, the 16th Amendment was formally ratified, having been approved by the required 36 states. For the first time in its history, the United States had a constitutional basis for a permanent nationwide income tax. And Congress wasted no time. Later that same year, the Revenue Act of 1913 was signed into law, imposing a 1% tax on incomes above $3,000, with a graduated surtax reaching a maximum of 7% on incomes exceeding $500,000. The rates were modest by today's standards. In its first year, the income tax collected $71 million, a fraction of what the tariff brought in. Only about 3% of American households earned enough to owe any tax at all. But the structure was in place. The legal and institutional machinery that the Civil War income tax had created, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, which had survived the repeal of the income tax in 1872 by continuing to collect excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco, was simply repurposed. When the income tax became permanent in 1913, the government did not need to build a new collection agency from scratch. The infrastructure was already there, waiting. And what happened next confirmed every fear the opponents of the income tax had voiced and vindicated every hope its supporters had held. Within just a few years, the income tax would transform the entire fiscal and political landscape of the United States beyond recognition. When the First World War erupted in 1914, barely a year after the amendment was ratified, the need for revenue exploded. The top income tax rate, which had been 7% in 1913, was raised to 15% in 1916, then to 67% in 1917, and finally to 77% in 1918. The number of Americans required to pay income tax expanded dramatically, and after the war ended, the rates came down, but they never returned anywhere close to the modest levels of 1913. The income tax had taken root, and it would only grow. By the Second World War, the transformation was complete. The tax base expanded to include the majority of working Americans, not just the wealthy elite. In 1943, the government introduced withholding, requiring employers to deduct taxes directly from workers' paychecks before they even saw the money. This was perhaps the most consequential innovation of all. Withholding made the income tax almost invisible. Instead of writing a large check to the government once a year, workers simply received a smaller paycheck every week. The pain of taxation was diffused, spread out, hidden inside the machinery of payroll. It was brilliant, and it permanently altered the relationship between the citizen and the state. But let's step back and consider what was actually lost when America transitioned from a tariff-funded government to an income tax-funded one. Because the pre-1913 system wasn't just a different way of collecting revenue, it reflected a fundamentally different philosophy of government. In the tariff era, the federal government was small by necessity. Tariffs could only generate so much revenue, especially because of a paradox that economists call the Laffer curve. If you raise tariff rates too high, you discourage imports, which shrinks the tax base and actually reduces revenue. So there was a natural ceiling on how much money the government could raise through tariffs alone, and that ceiling kept the government lean. Federal spending rarely exceeded 3% of GDP, and the government's responsibilities were limited to what today would be considered the bare essentials: national defense, foreign diplomacy, the postal service, customs enforcement, a court system, and the management of public lands. The income tax removed that ceiling. Once the government could tax income directly, there was no theoretical limit to how much revenue it could raise. And with unlimited revenue came unlimited ambition. Social Security was established in 1935. Medicare and Medicaid followed in 1965. The federal government expanded into education, housing, transportation, energy, environmental regulation, and dozens of other domains that would have been unimaginable to Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson. Today, the federal government collects roughly $4.4 trillion per year in revenue. Individual income taxes account for about $2.5 trillion of that. Payroll taxes for social